and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Makood with you at PTV World. In today's show, we will be talking about the much-awaited COP27 summit that is being held in Egypt. And this, of course, was a very, very important, especially to Pakistan, summit, which, of course, has been undergoing the impact of the devastating floods that happened earlier this year. And because of that, of course, we have seen much devastation in Pakistan, and in the aftermath of which many other crises that have been a result of these floods that we are still facing. This, of course, is important in terms of the kind of climate change catastrophe that Pakistan has faced and has faced in the past as well, and is likely to face in the future. And so such an important summit is very dear to our hearts. But what really is at stake here, that is, of course, in terms of what is needed in terms of global action, that is important in terms of the discussion. Considering, of course, the COP27 summit, it is the 27th such conference, it's important to hold into account exactly what sort of significance will this hold, how it will be different from the previous summits, how it's going to actually result in some sort of tangible action towards the people, especially those living in developing countries who contribute much less to global carbon emissions, and how exactly will that factor in, especially considering the loss and damage conversation, which gladly is part of the summit agenda that was decided yesterday. And this is important considering this is part of what Pakistan has been saying in the aftermath of the devastating floods and the climate change justice that is important for those who are responsible for increased global carbon emissions much more than the rest of the world. And so how exactly will that pan out, and what sort of financial infrastructure is going to be built around that is important. There is, of course, other issues related to the COP27 summit which are also going to be important, especially with reference to the kind of targets that have been set earlier. The UN Secretary General has reiterated that this is something extremely important and it cannot be put on the back burner anymore, and that we are racing towards climate change hell, and this is something which is extremely important, and if it is not done in terms of working together, we are going towards collective suicide, and we are rushing towards that. In fact, the current trends point out that carbon pollution is going to increase by 10% by the end of the decade, and so will the Earth's surface heat up to about 2.8 degrees Celsius. The Paris Agreement, of course, has set a target of 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial era, and this, of course, is an ambitious one, and the UN Secretary General has pressed for this and has asked the developed world to cut down on the global carbon emissions. The devastating floods in Pakistan are not the only example of the climate change catastrophe that we have seen. Of course, earlier there have been floods in Nigeria, there have been droughts in Kenya, Somalia and the US, and then, of course, unprecedented heat waves across 3 continents. So it's, of course, important to understand that this is a global issue that the world is facing, and so global action is required. But considering the fact that these conferences have happened in the past, have been happening for decades, we would like to also try and understand the kind of progress they've achieved and what is needed for them to actually result into something important. An important factor over here, of course, is that important climate change activists and leaders such as Greta Thunberg and others have boycotted this conference on the basis of the fact that this may not produce any results. And another question that has been put is also the fact that such conferences, unfortunately, have usually been sponsored by coal companies or other corporate clients that also contribute largely to global carbon emissions. So how exactly will this particular summit benefit the entire world and cater the needs of the population who are actually suffering right now is important. This is going to be the focus of our segment today, and we're going to try and understand all of these questions. For this and more, of course, I've been joined in the studios by senior analysts Farooq Patafi and Raja Faisal, and we've also been joined by our esteemed guests online, Dr. Salim Ali, distinguished professor and chair of geography at the University of Delaware, member of the United Nations International Resource Panel, and the author of Earthly Order, How Natural Laws Define Human Life. He's going to be joining us very soon, but we're now joined by Ali Sheikh, who's member of Pakistan Climate Change Council, chaired by the Prime Minister of Pakistan, and of course an expert in these matters. Thank you very much, Mr. Ali, for joining us and being a part of the debate. The COP27 summit, of course, is important to the entire world, but like I said earlier, much more at the moment, of course, to Pakistan, considering whatever we are facing at this moment at the brink of these devastating floods. How exactly do you think that this particular COP27 summit is going to benefit the way that the entire world needs to interact with each other, especially when it comes to the kind of climate change justice and the kind of loss and damage that has been talked about by Pakistan, especially in the aftermath of these devastating floods? Of course, we know that this is the 27th such conference. We have seen previous conferences as well. But in terms of course, the kind of victories that we hope to achieve, one is important in terms of having loss and damage on the agenda. But in terms of actual, real, tangible change, not just limited to this, but other factors regarding climate change as well, how hopeful are you of this being something different? Yes, Mr. Ali Toki, can you hear me? All right, I'll go to Dr. Salim Ali. Dr. Salim Ali, I'll take the same question from you while we wait. In terms of what has happened, of course, in the recent devastating floods, it's important for Pakistan that we get something tangible from this summit. In fact, of course, it's important to everybody who's facing the climate change impact. And as a result of course, the developed world and the way that the kind of global carbon emissions that exist worldwide. There is, of course, the impact of climate change, just as that Pakistan has been reiterating. But an important victory that we've seen, at least for now, is the fact that at least we're going to be talking about loss and damage and this conversation around this particular summit. But in terms of how these conferences have resulted in action in the past and how important it is right now in terms of the urgency of the matter, how hopeful are you in terms of what Pakistan or other countries such as Pakistan need to get out of these summits?
Well, these summits are very effective in creating international awareness of the issue. In terms of action, unfortunately, the way the process has been set up, it's very difficult to get tangible action when you have 193 member states of the United Nations who have to come at some joint strategy. So this is one of the great puzzles and challenges of international relations, is that you want to empower countries in such decision making, but just by the sheer number and the sheer diversity of views, you end up diluting any potential action. With climate change, we have seen the same happening. And of course, with all international treaties of this kind, it's what we call soft law. So countries, even if they make commitments, they can withdraw from them, as the United States did with the Paris Agreement. President Trump, when he came into office, the former president, he withdrew. The same can happen with developing countries who say they will meet targets, but they don't. Then what do you do? So this is the challenge. In terms of the Sharm-el-Sheikh meeting, the focus is on climate finance. And in that regard, I think the loss and damage commitment for the meeting in terms of the agenda is a very positive step, certainly for Pakistan. But even if the commitments are made, will the countries actually deliver the funds? The same challenge will remain. So I think that's where we need to maybe have a much more tangible strategy of how funds flow. The funds should be linked to certain kinds of emissions, and then there should be a very clear mechanism whereby those funds are then actually put into a trust account so they can be distributed.
Right. Dr. Salim, before I ask my question, let me actually tell you that I really enjoyed your participation in one of my favorite podcasts, the Michael Sharma Show. It was really out of this world. And then after that, I kept on looking for your book. I could not find it, at least in Pakistani market. I hope it becomes available soon. But regarding what you were saying earlier, that Donald Trump actually removed his country for a short while out of Paris Accord. This is the nature of democracy. Tomorrow there are elections in the US as well, midterms, and you never know whether the House is going to flip, whether the Senate also going to slide to the other side. So there will always be possibility of losing one of the major engines of movement forward. So how do you think UN actually copes with that?
Yes, no, that's a great question overall in terms of, we have what we call the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, how treaties are actually implemented. And I would say that there needs to be some revisiting of when these kinds of commitments are made. What is the obligation, even if there are changes in the political process in each country? And so this can be done, but it requires some mechanism. I mean, there are are some international institutions like the World Trade Organization, which has a much more robust commitment mechanism. And some of that has to do with the peer pressure that comes from being in the WTO, but some of it is enshrined into the WTO's treaty system. And so when, like with China, currently there's a huge international conflict with many players, certainly the West and the US, there is a soft conflict of sorts. But because China wants to remain part of the WTO, it's likely to continue to abide by the WTO mandate. That is not true of international environmental treaties. So I think that's what we need to do to address that concern, which you have rightly raised. And regarding my book, thank you for your kind words. Actually, the Pakistan edition will be coming out with Oxford University Press as well within the next 6 months.
Looking forward.
Dr. Salim, if we look at obviously this current COP27, of course, loss and damage finance facility, it is the core subject today we are seeing. Is it possible that in coming future, obviously Pakistan is one of the countries which is worst hit by climate change, and the very recent floods, they are part of it as well, and to some extent it had everything to do with managing the water rather than, of course, influx. The water influx was too big and it could not be managed. In coming future, could we see that we might see some kind of financing when it comes to building mega structures that can help Pakistan to manage the water in coming future, and that can be part of this deal as well, sir?
And Dr. Salim, before you answer, let me just quickly welcome in the debate Mr. Ali Tawqir Sheikh, Member Pakistan Climate Change Council. Thank you very much for joining us. Yes, Dr. Salim, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for that question. Regarding the financing of infrastructure, there are some projects which can be supported through existing mechanisms. There's the Green Climate Fund, which was established in COP15, actually, a long time ago in Copenhagen, and since then has been building resources. And Pakistan has actually a project through the Green Climate Fund, which is aimed at addressing infrastructure for channeling water during high weather extreme events of the kind we had with the flooding, and using existing depressions to channel that water into basins. And so that project is already underway. But in terms of large dams and those kinds of projects, I think that is a different story, because there are also environmental impact assessments around those projects themselves, which can be much more contentious. But the Green Climate Fund is an important resource for some of these mitigation and adaptation projects.
Right, absolutely. Mr. Ali, considering, of course, that the COP27 summit is very important to Pakistan, especially in the current times that we're experiencing post the devastating floods, it's important for us to, of course, come out of the summit with some sort of tangible change and some sort of action. This has been the hope in the previous conferences and summits as well. But of course, as we were earlier discussing with Dr. Salim, there hasn't been any sort of a binding element to whatever pledges or commitments that have been made, and we haven't really come up with any sort of mechanism or infrastructure to actually deliver the kind of promises that have been made by different countries around the world. And so at the end of the day, if there isn't much in terms of the implementation, we don't achieve much, and at the same time, the devastating impact of climate change is something that we and other such countries continue to experience. Based on this and the way that this has happened in the past, what can Pakistan push for in terms of course, the kind of accountability that is needed? Of course, the UNSG talks about climate change justice and a moral imperative, but perhaps the countries need much more than that for them to act.
Thank you for asking this very important question. This is a very imperfect forum, but this is the only forum that we have. And it's not a totally useless forum. 5 years ago, we were projecting increase in climate temperatures to more than 5 degrees through the century. We are looking at 5, 6, 7, 8, depending on different models. And now we are looking at not exactly 1.5, but 2.5 to 3, 2.8 degrees temperature change. It's quite an accomplishment that in a short period of time, we have reduced the projections as much. The criticism is valid. Just about every report that has emerged as a run up to the COP has indicted the process, saying that we are failing in long-term commitments on net zero and 2050 or 2060, and so much so even on 2030 commitments that are just around the corner in 7 years' time. But having said that, I think the world is on track to reduce its carbon emissions. And then there are many unaddressed issues or not fully addressed issues, such as what do we do with financing countries that are constantly under siege of extreme weather events. They do not have very strong absorptive capacity. Example, GCF promises to disperse 100 billion. We always criticize them that Global North has not honored their commitment of 100 billion disbursement. But whatever little they have dispersed, Pakistan's share is not even 1% of that. So just imagine that if GCF was fully operational and dispersing 100 billion a year, do you think we have the capacity to submit proposals and implement projects worth 1% of that, 1 billion? That's a long journey that we have. Now there is a promise that there can be a fund for loss and damage.
Right.
We need to strengthen our absorptive capacity. We need to strengthen our accountability and transparency mechanisms so that we enjoy greater trust of the world. But my main point is somewhat different. My main point, man, is that this unfortunate flood in Pakistan has provided us a very rare and unique opportunity to engage with the world as a responsible international player. The presence of UN Secretary General at the pavilion today that was organized by government of Pakistan and his endorsement of Pakistan's case was wholehearted, enthusiastic, and unqualified. He said, for example, that if anybody had a doubt about loss and damage, visit Pakistan. He said, I've seen numerous disasters in the world, but I've never seen such a grave tragedy that humankind has witnessed as we saw personally in Pakistan.
And Sheikh
It's
Sahib,
one
that
thing
is,
for us
I'm glad that you have brought up this matter as well. And loss and damage is a great addition.
when somebody else argues for your case, and that too a person no less than Secretary General. He
Right.
talked about a special fund for low middle income countries. Presently, there are some windows available for least developed countries, but not Pakistan-like countries that are low middle income countries. And he argued that G20, when they meet in Bali in a few months' time, should take up this case and develop a special window. He
Right.
picked up
Sheikh
a
Sahib,
point
great
for
to have you in the
disasters
show
we
as
need to
well.
have special
Allow me to actually ask a further question because this is a concern that is there. I understand that you opened with actually saying that it is an imperfect world and it is an imperfect forum as well. But what do you do when bits of it keep on passing out? We don't know whether after 2024, Donald Trump, if he returns to power or somebody like him, will continue to support the forum. We don't know what becomes of European participation. China at times actually seems interested, but then we know what President Obama actually wrote about it. So do you think that countries like Pakistan should actually pin hopes with such a forum? Sheikh Sahib.
Please, yes, indeed. I think questions like this, please pardon me to say this, miss the main point. Please look at the economic growth trajectory of those countries who have adopted climate smart development, including low emissions technologies and renewable energies. You see that their growth rate has moved up. It includes India, China, US, EU, UK, and many other countries. So it's not whether or not these countries honor their commitment. I think the opportunity is for Pakistan to get on a path that is transformative for its economy. It brings innovation and new technologies in areas that increase our productivity, reduce our energy emissions, and increase our energy savings, but at the same time lift millions and millions of people above the poverty line who are surviving at criminally low level of human dignity. So I'm very optimistic in this process. I think the world is transforming itself. Pakistan needs a wake-up call. We are still stuck with the old-fashioned economic development model that's based on subsidies, that's based on elite capture, that elites are infrastructural projects that add to our vulnerability, and that are basically icons or monuments of maladaptation. Professor Salim will bear me out on this. Always a better path of development available to us if we systematically can pursue that in coming years.
Yeah, very true.
Yes,
Dr.
absolutely.
Salim, if we talk about obviously this COP27, can we say that it can lay good foundations for Pakistan's case in coming up Paris Club, meetup that can obviously be a help when it comes to Pakistan seeking favor or seeking waivers in the money it owes to the other countries, and knowing the fact that on ground, of course, Pakistan's economy is suffering big time, and we have bear a damage that was uncontrollable. 1/3 of the country was underwater, and of course we have lost crops as well, and the very next season of wheat, it would be not a good season of wheat, and of course we would be requiring there will be extra burden on our economy next year as well. So looking at all of these things, can we expect that COP27 can play a role for Paris Club meeting?
Yes, I think it can play a role in terms of revisiting the conversation of what they used to call debt for nature swaps. And basically, this was an idea developed a few decades ago, more for biodiversity conservation, where countries which had a very high debt, they agreed to have conservation of forests in trade for mitigation of debt, basically from developed countries. And I think the same kind of argument can be made by Pakistan for a debt for climate contingency swap, basically. And the other point I would make is that for people who are more in the private sector and, political candidates like Trump, if he comes back, one way to get to them with regard to climate change is to bring in the business sector around insurance of climate change. And there are new insurance products, wherever people who are business inclined see that there's an opportunity for revenue generation, they are likely to be drawn in. There's a new insurance product which has become more popular called parametric insurance, and this is insurance which is for extreme events. Usually when you have an insurance policy, even if you have a small event, you have a deductible, but you are still eligible to apply. Parametric insurance is only for very high threshold events, and so the whole business model is very different. But it is well suited for these kinds of extreme climate events. So even the Global Environment Facility, I serve on the science panel for the Global Environment Facility. They are a multilateral trust fund which supports environmental treaties, and they have begun to bring in parametric insurance into some of their climate change projects. So that could be another way to handle this.
Right, Sana, with your permission, let me go back to Sheikh Saab. Sheikh Saab, listening to both of you gentlemen, I got a lot of hope, and I thought that both of you are very optimistic. But that is happening, your optimism at a time when publications like The Economist are turning cover, say goodbye to 1.5 degrees, target. And we have seen similar kind of criticism coming from all over the world. But my concern at this moment is all the recommendations that both of you actually gave and offer at this moment, they might actually impact in a long run. But Pakistan's $33 billion bill is urgent. How do you actually fix that problem? How do you find that kind of fiscal space in the international system to address that concern?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. And I know your literary pursuits are very strong. And you have reminded me.
So are yours.
You have reminded me your a quotation from Mark Twain, who said, "Rumors of my death are grossly exaggerated." So I think yes, 1.5 is becoming increasingly hard, but it's still within the reach. It can be done. Having said that, without that hope, people like you and me and millions more, and perhaps billions more in the developing country have no other hope. Look at 1.1 degree change in last 70, 80 years have brought our economy into its knees. There is no other way for me to put that. God forbid if it was 1.5, I don't know what we'll do. We'll collapse as a civilization, we'll collapse as ecosystems. And please remember, 1.5 global average does not necessarily mean that at the glacial level it will be 1.5. All studies show that it will be at least 3 times higher, and many other areas of Pakistan. So it's an existential battle that I cannot win, you cannot win, but we can struggle to make sure that we win. Now, I want to come to the other point that you made about 30 million. I look at that figure, pardon me, it's a government TV channel. I look at that figure with very deep skepticism. This is a figure that was reached by the potential lenders for those schemes that are mentioned. So if we ever undertake any reconstruction, we'll need to get loans and support from the same organizations. And at the same time, this is a paradox that no report would have been more credible without such credible names as World Bank and ADB and EU and others. So I wish we had initiated a similar kind of damage assessment led by Pakistani businessmen and undertaken by Pakistani government, engaging the community level damages, which are oftentimes not included because the focus here is typically large infrastructure and others, to get to know what is the exact trend, if not the exact amount of our losses. Now, the most important loss that we have is essentially the collapse of our urban governance or semi-urban governance systems. They collapse with the first sneeze of our weather system. And then we have to invite other people to come and support us. So I think we need to make investments in our governance systems, local governance system, local government, if I have to use a stronger word than governance, local government with SOPs and budgets, they need to be prioritized so that some degree of investment could begin to happen at the local level resilience.
Right,
It will be
absolutely. And of course, there's a lot
far
in
more
terms of
dearest
the
to us.
local
Allow me to
responsibility that we
complete this
have.
sentence, ma'am.
Right.
It will be far more dearer to me than a 10, $20 billion worth of water sector project or a reservoir than investing in the entire province or several provinces at the community level with the same amount during the next decade
Right,
and two
sure.
to
And
ensure
that, of course,
that we can
makes sense. But of course, in terms of the climate change issue, there's a lot in terms of the global responsibility that's also important. There's much that Pakistan can do at home, but we'll still be, of course, facing the kind of global climate change impact that's there. And so we need that sort of action too. Dr. Salim, earlier we were talking about various aspects in terms of involving the business sector or the private sector in as well. And you're giving a valid example in terms of what could be done. But there's also one concern that is being shared with regards to such summits is that usually they have been sponsored by corporate companies or big multinationals, even coal companies who are not backing any sort of commitment towards in decreasing their usage of coal or contributing to global carbon emissions, yet they are sponsoring summits such as the COP27. And when that happens and is not followed up by any sort of accountability, that's of course is a problem and puts a huge question mark. There's so much in terms of the trend towards sustainability and CSR and what companies can do, but not much in terms of their actual contribution towards climate change and its impact. Is this really giving a good message when we have such sponsors on board, and whether or not such platforms need to take into account the kind of accountability by even their partners so that whenever we talk about action, at least we can start from the summit itself?
And could you also address this issue that was raised by Sheikh Saab regarding veracity or reliability of World Bank data or their numbers?
Yes, certainly. It's first of all, it's great to reconnect with Sheikh Saab. I had the pleasure of working with him in the past when he was CEO of Lead Pakistan, and he clearly knows much more about Pakistan's domestic situation than I do because I live abroad. But what I can comment on with reference to the fossil fuel companies or any private sector, whether it's in Pakistan or abroad, is we need to have a strategy for working at all levels. And even if there is the danger of greenwash, we cannot afford to not allow these business enterprises to attend these conferences, sponsor events, and so on. Better have them in the tent than outside the tent. Because before, they were actually doing a lot to undermine climate change. At least now they're willing to engage. Now, it's true that some of these fossil fuel companies are doing it through their sort of technological solutions mantra, where they're saying that we will have carbon capture and storage, we will figure out a way to basically eat the cake and have it too. But they do have a point. If you are not going to be able to have mitigation through emissions reductions because of the way in which people want to live their lives, then you need to try to have some technological solution. So even though there are limitations to technological solutions, which is what these fossil fuel companies are offering many times, we have no other option. And as far as the World Bank veracity of the data is concerned, the data is reported by governments. We need a much better auditing system of the data. I was in Gabon, for example, in West Africa recently for field work. And this is a country which has become a real darling of development donors because they have a lot of protected areas. But it's a major oil and gas exporter. And they have argued that they have kept their forests because they have they've had oil and gas. So they've said basically we were not incentivizing deforestation because we had oil and gas. Some of the data they report, I wonder in terms of even deforestation, because I saw a lot of the logging that was going on there still. So yes, we need on the ground auditing and verification. But since this is a debate, I would say maybe where I might have a friendly disagreement with Sheikh Saab is around the gravity of what would happen if we did go above. Yes, of course, we wish we didn't go above, but I think we now have to think much more about adaptation, and we have to consider what are the opportunities for climate change. Like one of the projects I'm working on is around the polar regions. What will be the opportunities? Tomorrow actually I'm heading to Antarctica to do some work around what would be the redevelopment of the old sites in the Antarctic Peninsula for opportunities. Similarly, Pakistan and other countries do have to start thinking about what will be the adaptive opportunities of climate change.
Right, absolutely. But Sana, earlier when you were asking this question about climate change, particularly about climate summit being filled by the biggest polluters, and Dr. Salim's answer as well, it reminded me of a sitcom called Veep, where they are holding a women rights, conference without women. And there
That actually
too,
happened.
and there too, they are actually talking in favor of women, but suddenly they're told they cannot.
Yeah.
So at this moment, the concern is that somehow, if we end up, allowing these polluters that kind of space, they are going to veto it, and they are perhaps not going to do anything about it.
Exactly. Dr. Salim, one last question from my side for you. Obviously, Farooq has mentioned about the biggest polluters. Can we say that the global involvement which we expected in this crisis in Pakistan related to climate change, we could not see their participation in a sort of a big number just because of one reason? Just because of one reason, that their priority at this hour was not climate change, but their priority was whatever was going on in Ukraine and the Ukrainian crisis, sir?
No, absolutely. This is the challenge with any kind of international mechanism that you get distractions. You have a zero-sum game where you have a fixed amount of resources which need to be then divided up for different causes around the world, especially for humanitarian purposes. That's the challenge, that after the Pakistan floods, a lot of the funding that was coming in was under the humanitarian label. And now then when you have 3 million refugees immediately also happening at the same time in a country which are closer to home for the donors, then obviously the prioritization is going to get skewed. That's why we need something much more robust at an international level. That was the goal of the Green Climate Fund. If there's a loss and damage fund, then that money would be sequestered and only used for these purposes. And then we don't have to do this ad hoc kind of mechanism that we currently have.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Salim Ali. I believe you had to leave by 10:45, but thank you very much for joining us and being a part of the debate. It was a pleasure having you as always. And I'll come to you, Mr. Ali. Of course, there's an important aspect of the international opinion as well in terms of how there needs to be some sort of accountability when we talk about such summits or even perhaps those who are contributing towards global carbon emissions. It's important to have that sort of activism in the public at large as well. And we need that both at home and internationally. But unfortunately, we've seen that perhaps these activists have either been sidelined or have boycotted this summit. And because of that, of course, it impacts the way that it is being viewed. But even if we disregard the impact on this particular summit, in general, how important do you think it is for us to be able to engage that sort of body into this conversation as well, and to also develop that at home? Because, of course, we have other concerns, especially those of political and economic nature, which seem to be much more urgent and take a lot of space on our media channels as well, unfortunately. However, at the end of the day, if this particular issue is as urgent as we're talking about, how much of that activism even exists at home, and how can we contribute to the international aspect of this activism as well to mobilize or become the force behind the action that is needed?
Ma'am, I think I missed part of your question because of connectivity. But to the extent that I could understand, I will put Pakistan's climate change policy on 3 tracks. One track is very serious financial transactions, which means loans, grants, donations, whatever you can get. And that incidentally will fall under the rubric of solidarity. It's a very big human crisis. Please note, I'm not saying humanitarian crisis, because the international assistance for humanitarian crisis is going down. So human crisis of unknown precedent, unknown scale, biblical scale as we call it here. So it's the international solidarity that we need to appeal to get international assistance in this regard. The second track is engaging systematically, professionally, and technically in various windows of negotiations and discussions at COP and COP-like processes that deal with carbon trading and climate finance windows and operationalizing adaptation fund, or revisiting the rules of GCF, and so on. There are many, many tracks, and as many tracks as Pakistan cannot handle. They are beyond our present capacity, but we need to quickly strengthen that capacity and engage them. The more we engage at that level, and that's a slow process, costly process, we'll have to engage in this, the better results we will have for Pakistan on the long run. And third is more ideological or orientation related question, such as human rights and climate justice and just transition and things of this sort, that are the vision that how the world should look like. This is not exactly we have. So the challenge for the government will be balancing these 3. If we become too strong on climate justice and repression and penalties and that sort, the first track gets adversely affected. Therefore, we need to be very careful in orchestrating our 3-track policy. The first 2 that I mentioned need to be very strong. And the third one, the government can pursue perhaps in partnership with many other countries, particularly most vulnerable countries group, CVF, and non-profits and civil societies in the country and international CSOs, because they have the resources to invest, they have the freedom and the and the capacity to engage in the narrative that to build the narrative that the world is willing to hear, and
Right.
then they are also engaged in the domestic political processes. So these three tracks come to my mind as far as engaging in the global setting are concerned.
Absolutely. Sheikh Saab, while we are I understand that now, right now we are talking about international opportunity where Pakistan can go and advocate its case. But regarding what happened, and we are actually passing through it, the floods, they're there. And I understand that regarding assessment, the numbers might not be here or there. But the biggest concern at this moment is that there are so many challenges. Do we even have a correct idea what we need to do inside the country to ensure that these floods don't cause such devastation in coming years?
Three things. One, have local governments as the first line of defense for environment and climate change resilience. This means that local shamlat, local footpaths, local nalas, local flood channels, they are all responsibility of local government. So they are able to manage flood and evacuate people and have early warning systems at that level. That's the first. Second, our zoning laws are very poor, and oftentimes new housing societies and poor people's um, housing, as we saw in Balochistan and parts of Sindh, is located in the floodplains. We should not obstruct the flow of water. Water bodies have right to flow. The more we try to resist them, the more we'll hurt ourselves. So the best is not to allow any new construction in those areas and develop some plans, phased plans to come out of the settlements that we already have. And the third is that stronger compliance of laws that we have. Kind of thing that we see in Sawat where hotels are collapsing. They're not collapsing because they're bad hotels. They're collapsing because they were violating the laws of the land. And that cannot happen unless the local administration was involved. And therefore
Sheikh
we
Saab,
need
that is a very good point. And I remember those images immediately. They actually caused, the impact and the way that influenced us as well. But the concern at this moment is not merely zoning laws. There seems to be a concern regarding drainage system. It seems that Pakistan South is waterlogged even now, and we have some problem with infrastructure as well. And our obsession with big ticket items like dams and reservoirs actually obscures the fact that most of Pakistan is not properly handled. What do you say on that?
Thank you for raising this question. I'll give you a slightly longer answer, but please bear with me.
Yeah, please.
The Convention on Climate Change has two tracks, mitigation and adaptation. We have been saying for last 14 years, 15 years that there should be loss and damage as a third pillar. The Western countries did not agree and they said deal with loss and damage as a subset of adaptation. That's where we stand. Now while we are struggling with the third pillar, I want to propose to you, based on the question that you asked, the fourth pillar that has come very strongly in Pakistan. A lot of development that was undertaken in this country with international finance and lending has turned out to be maladaptation, and they have caused a lot of devastation and misery to our people. And southern parts of Pakistan is a very good example where LBOD and RBOD trapped water, blocked their passage, and therefore it was a standing flood. It was not the kind of flood that people are used to having, whereby the water comes, surges, and then it goes down. So for this kind of thing, I have an ongoing discussion with several colleagues internationally that we need to have a fourth pillar of negotiations in UNFCCC or other forums, whereby these lenders who caused maladaptation in urban development and agricultural development and rural development should begin rectifying that. That can be by suspending those loans or investing to rectify from their own resources.
That's a good idea.
And particularly if these were known risks they took. It is a different thing if the science didn't tell them. But if they knew and they are expected to know better water flows before they work on a product like RBOD and LBOD. So in my view, it is absolutely legitimate for us to start raising this question that how you can help us undo with your resources without we having to borrow additional sums.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. Ali Tauqir Sheikh, for joining us and being a part of the debate and for those very valid and very important suggestions that need to be, of course, incorporated if we really wish to fight climate change, both at home and internationally as well. The COP27, of course, is a platform that is important, and we really hope that we see the kind of change that is needed, and it's not merely just conversations, but real action also that helps the people who are suffering, including those in Pakistan. That's all that we have from the debate. See you tomorrow.